Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll now turn it over to our moderator.
Thank you, Tara. Good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday. Thank you so much for joining me here today for our session on the future of work post-COVID-19. My name is Svenja Gudell. I'm the Chief Economist at Zillow Group. And I think we can all agree that COVID-19 has caused a bunch of disruption to the labor markets across the world. And millions of people have lost their jobs, unfortunately. And many others, like many of us here, have had to get used to working remotely from home oftentimes. In general, the pandemic has sped up a whole bunch of trends that have already existed pre-pandemic, although it has really speeding up and made it much more urgent that we kind of get used to a bunch of these changes. Not a whole lot of people working remotely prior to all of this. And I think now we can all agree that remote work is here to stay, or at least we'll find out if the panel agrees. The adoption of AI and automation is become much more urgent, particularly in high contact fields. So a lot of changes are happening in the labor market at this moment, and some really super interesting things that I believe are going to be with us for quite some time. To discuss these trends, I'm thrilled that I'm joined today by Sonia Jaffe, Senior Research Economist at Microsoft, Meghan Reibstein, VP of Organizational Operations at Zillow, and Daniela Scur, Assistant Professor of Strategy at the Dyson School of Applied Economics and Management at Cornell University. Thank you so much for joining me, everyone. Before we jump in, please remember, if you have questions that you'd like us to discuss, fill them right into the chat function right here in the Zoom window. You don't need to go into Pathable. You can do it right here. And we'll hopefully get a chance to answer all of those questions. And before we jump into our panel discussion, I'd like all the speakers to go around real quick and introduce themselves, give you a sense of where they're coming from and a little bit of what the work that they have been doing as part of work in the pandemic. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Sonia to get us started. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Svenja. So as Svenja mentioned, I'm at Microsoft. I'm in the office of the Chief Economist, and for the past year and a half or so, I've been part of a cross-company initiative to study and learn from this big change in work practices. The New Future of Work initiative has been doing research internally and also making much of it available externally. Well, I think we'll dive into some questions, but I'll first just maybe highlight a few broad themes that we've found in the studies across telemetry studies, surveys, diary studies. One is heterogeneity of people's experience. I helped with one survey where basically a third of participants said they were more productive or more satisfied working from home than they had been in the office. A third said they were less productive, less satisfied, and then a third said it was about the same. So just a real variety of experience. There's a lot of different benefits and challenges that people face, and a lot of them are linked. People really appreciate the flexibility of being able to interweave work and life more easily, but going right along with that, they struggle with boundaries between work and life when those things are happening in the same place. Another example is some people feeling like they have a more autonomy when they're working at home because managers aren't able to micromanage quite as much, but at the same time, they miss the connection and the collaboration with their colleagues. And so those are a couple of the really linked benefits and challenges we'd have. And related to the missing of connection with colleagues, there's a lot of network effects around working from home that we've been thinking about a lot in terms of, for many people, one of the main reasons to go into the office is to see their collaborators. Microsoft did an internal survey, and the top 2 reasons of why people want to spend more time, go back into the office, spend more time in the office, were to collaborate with colleagues and to socialize with colleagues. And so if your colleagues aren't in the office, there's not as much reason to go in. And on the flip side, we found that at the beginning of the pandemic, people who'd been remote previously were actually really happy with it because they were no longer the odd one out. Everyone was remote. It was easier for them to participate in meetings and conversations. So on both sides, it kind of works better when other people are doing it. And then the other thing I want to just flag as we talk about kind of what people have experienced over the past year and a half and what we expect going forward is that I think we're probably all aware that working from home during a pandemic is not necessarily the same as working from home in normal times. And that a lot of the things people felt in terms of stress or loneliness were probably partially due from work from home, but partially due to there being a pandemic and lockdowns and not being able to see non-work friends socially either. And we've done some research of really trying to separate out those two effects, which I think is important for thinking about the future. So I'm happy to dive into any of those topics in the Q&A, but I'll leave it at that.
Fantastic. No, I just had to chuckle when you're talking through being able to, when everyone's remote. I keep thinking back to the days when, back in the day we had blue jeans meetings and it was like 10 people in the office and 3 people dialed in. It was a terrible experience, but we can talk more about that in a moment. Daniela, I'll throw it over to you. Can you walk us through some work?
Thank you. Yeah. So let me first of all just say thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's great to be part of this conversation. So I'm an economist, a professor at Cornell University, and my research is on managers and management practices more broadly, and basically how organizations organize, and the impact that managers and those kind of practices have on productivity, but also things like labor market flows and wages inequality and task allocation and so on. So I study different types of organizations, including private organizations like firms and manufacturing firms more specifically, but also other types of private organizations, but also public ones like schools and hospitals. So, it's broad in that sense. So I know that here we're going to focus on tech, but I do spend a bit of time thinking about just more generally as well, how it affects other industries. And what's interesting is also over the summer, I actually ran a data collection project that behaves a little bit like a small firm. So we used to have it just happen in one building, and then now we have it happen completely online. And so having this experience of having a particular team that was all in one place and then a completely distributed team has been quite interesting from also an academic perspective, as I see what we think about kind of actually happen. So I'm not completely removed from the day-to-day what actually happens in organizations. But in general, when I think about the future of work, most of the time I'm thinking about what that means for managers, right? And so in particular, what that means for organizing teams and then monitoring the work that the teams are doing. And there's been quite a bit of research on this. I've done a bit of work on this, but I have colleagues who've spent a lot of time doing work on this too. And the idea is that that there's some firms that were just better placed to move to remote work in a pinch. But then as the pandemic kept going on, other firms that perhaps weren't as well suited, they started kind of building those capacities so that they could move at least part of their work. And so there's this element of forced experimentation, which I think is really interesting. And in industries like tech, of course, there was this, you guys already had a big part of your work happening in computers or, in the types of tasks that you didn't need to be there in person all the time. So there was, in a sense, already a set of monitoring processes that were already in place for managers and for workers. But other industries like manufacturing or education, which I also study, a big part of the task was actually in person. So much harder to actually manage that transition. But again, this period of forced experimentation meant that some they had to do it, and then found out that some of the tasks that previously they thought couldn't be done from home could. So I think that's the next set of where that future of work for those other industries is going is also going to be pretty interesting as well. Like over the summer, again, that project I was mentioning, we used to be able to find managers in the office very easily. And then now it was nearly impossible to find them because the managerial, so this is a manufacturing firm, the workers might have been at the firm, but the managers weren't. So just thinking about how all of that really, is gonna evolve over the next few months and years is interesting. And then just more generally, including also very innovative fields like in tech, just what's going to be this eventual equilibrium of across the hierarchies as we reorganize workflow, and these questions of people preferences and people learning their preferences. They like to be at work because of the different, a third of people want to talk to their colleagues, as Sonia said. So how does that kind of feature into both how we're going to work, but also how the managers are going to start learning how to manage their teams that might be partially entirely from working from home and then partially in the office, and how to make sure that there's equity across that, I think is going to be a key problem for managers going forward. So I'll stop there and looking forward to the questions.
Awesome, thank you. No, I think we'll definitely want to dig in on the manager side. I know in Zillow's, or at least for my own team, on the feedback side, managers have experienced the pandemic much more harshly, if you will, in some sense, because it's been really hard for them to manage remotely and do that change. But with that, let me turn it over to Meghan. She can tell us a lot more about surveys at Zillow as well, but would love to hear, Meghan, where you're coming from.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Happy to be here. This is my favorite topic to talk about, so I'm excited, and especially to hear these different perspectives from Daniela and Sonia. As Sonia, or excuse me, Svenja shared, I'm a leader at Zillow. I actually just pivoted a week or two ago into a formal product management and flexible work role, really similar to the work I have been doing for the last couple of years. But I think we've recognized it's time to name that flexible work is a job at our company and a thing that we are thinking about all of the time. So I've been at Zillow for about 2.5 years. I joined with a focus on scaling our organization and improving our product management processes, and with a hope to create a work from anywhere program. Then COVID happened, and so the last 20 months or so have been sort of full-fledged on how do we build our flexible work program. I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute, but just speak a little bit more to my background. Prior to Zillow, I was at Amazon for 7 years, mostly in product management roles, and then in a variety of product and business roles before that at other industries, sizes, shapes, and my training in economics is a C in macro econ freshman year of college. So I can't offer much from that perspective. I'm still mystified by the profession and in awe of what you all do. So I come from very much a product launch mindset and an incremental change mindset. I care deeply about flexible work personally. I am certainly biased. I myself moved during the pandemic from Seattle to Asheville, North Carolina, where I am now, because of flexibility. I didn't do it to put myself in the position of seeing this from another angle, but it's certainly been interesting to do this work and see it from a remote position. At Zillow, we kind of dove in full force when the pandemic began. We started surveying our employees a couple of weeks into the pandemic, about assuming at that time that it might be a couple of months, situation that we were in, asking about, both their pandemic well-being, but also, their sort of flexible work thoughts and what they might want post-pandemic on this topic. And sort of we overwhelmingly heard, I want flexibility. I want to be able to work from home. And so we made commitments early on. We didn't wait to do research. We didn't sort of wait to have the answers. We said, okay, we're committed, we're going to figure this out. So we've taken a really hyper transparent approach with our employee base this whole time, done a lot of measurement. And I can speak to some of that today, but we are both sort of kind of all in, and in some ways kind of leading from the front lines perspective on this in tech, but then also like scratching the surface of what there is to learn about this topic and learn about in a post-pandemic reality. And so I'm really excited to be here today and maybe complement the perspectives of Daniela and Sonia just from a frontline leader's perspective that's building one of these programs in a tech environment.
Great, thank you so much, Meghan. I think what I'd love to jump into first, and I think all three of you have talked about this a little bit, is that remote work during the pandemic will certainly not be the exact same as remote work post-pandemic. And I'd love to think about productivity, how the role of the manager, how we think about, at Zillow, we have an interesting thing, the one Zoom, all Zoom concept, to avoid those dreaded meetings where 5 or 10 people are in a room and 3 people have to dial in, and the inequality that can cause. So yeah, how do we think about the changes that are going to happen once we hopefully move beyond the pandemic situation, and COVID has become endemic, and we just have to kind of live with it. And what does remote work look like then? And feel free to anyone, of course, to weigh in, but maybe Sonia will kick it off with you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a big piece in terms of people's stress levels and video fatigue, that particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, when all of social life was also online, that we are obviously not expecting to continue to the same extent. I think there's a separate piece. So you mentioned a lot of different things there. I guess on the one Zoom, all Zoom, I haven't heard it phrased that way, but people have been talking about like doing all remote meetings instead of hybrid meetings, where even if some people are in the office, having everyone join from their own device to have that level playing field or equal experience. And I think I think for some types of meetings that makes a lot of sense. I think for other types of meetings, there's advantages to the folks who are in the office together, and and wanting to say like, okay, we recognize that there's a trade-off, and people are going to lose the in-office people will lose something of like not being able to interact quite as spontaneously or read the room in the same way, and then the remote people will gain something. And I think that thinking like acknowledging the trade-off and thinking about it on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to a blanket like we're just always going to go, if there's someone who's remote, everyone goes remote, I think is more the approach that I think that my team will take. And I know that from a tooling perspective, Microsoft is also thinking about, okay, how can we make hybrid meetings better? And again, when you think about that trade-off, it's like, okay, well, if we decide that it's worthwhile for the in-room people to have those advantages, you also have to say like, okay, and you guys are going to do the extra effort to be inclusive and not make it suck for the remote people the way it did pre-pandemic. And that's both about the tools. I mean, Microsoft Teams thinking about how to surface remote people, and then it's also about just meeting practices of making sure you're soliciting input from people who are remote. Maybe you want people who are in the room to still use some electronic version of hand. If it's a bigger meeting, use an electronic version of hand raising instead of just jumping in order to give everybody the same chance to come in. So I think that there are ways, both culturally and technically, that we can make hybrid meetings suck less. And so I think that for some types of meetings, it's worthwhile, and for others, maybe it's not.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I do want to remind everyone listening in, feel free to put your questions in the chat. I am keeping track, and we'll get to the first one right now. There was an interesting one about needing managers a whole lot less in this remote environment. And, post-pandemic, do we think we won't need as many managers anymore? Danielle, what's your take on that one?
Oh, well, so that's the kind of question that very productive people often ask. So I see his name, Michael Donnelly. So good for you. You're a very productive person. So I think it is interesting. It's a very interesting question, because I think the extent to which we're going to need managers is actually perhaps even more so than we needed before. Because before, there was a sense in which you could just you always had eyes on some of your very good people, and you didn't have to necessarily go and check in even for the 30 minutes as the question came in. But it was, I think now managers spend a lot of time behind the scenes just actually checking in on everyone and asking, making sure, are you okay? Do you need anything? Are you, where are we with the deadlines? And I think there's, before, when we were all in person, it was a lot easier to just sort of walk down the hall and say, I'm having a problem. Can you help me with this? Is it something like a quick question? Whereas now sometimes there's a barrier to asking questions, because it's going to be written down, and then are you going to sound silly? Do you not know? And it's less of, I think it was a lot less of a problem early in the pandemic because there was a lot of social capital that was already built that was basically just transferred over. So if you already had a very good relationship with your manager, it was a lot easier to then just, you don't mind sort of sounding silly or anything, asking questions because they know, they've seen, you've worked together for a while and whatnot. You have that trust, that relational capital built. But then if it's a completely new person, you kind of don't know each other yet. You could try, and you could try to have meetings over Zoom, and you can, but it just takes longer in general to kind of build that kind of relationship to get there. So now from will we need managers? As long as there's different types of workers, that some workers are very good at just working by themselves and doing things, and they kind of, understand the task and go for it. Great. Managers love those. Those are the people that don't need a lot of instruction or a lot of hand-holding. But also tends to be some people who've had a lot more experience and know what they're doing. Like there's a lot of people who are new to the workforce, and it's not their fault that they don't know what it is that they need to do. And a big part of the manager's role is actually, leading them into a position where they might be able to do more autonomous work later. So I think as long as we have new teams being formed and new people needing to have structure on their conversations and how to work, we're going to still need managers.
Yeah, makes sense. And you bring up an interesting point, because I do think all of this has an impact on culture, right? And how do we maintain the office culture, or now the non-office culture, the company culture as a whole? Do you have any thoughts on, and any of you, how company culture is going to change, or how we're going to be able to translate that into the remote environment?
I can jump in there, Svenja. I mean, I think it changes. Like that answer feels pretty black and white, which is it changes. I think we have sort of made a point to say we're never going back to the way it was. And that's been sort of part of the mantra that I've led through. And that has been appealing to employees at Zillow. And it's not to say there weren't some good things that we can pull forward from the past. But I think, on the topic of managers and how culture changes, like, I don't know that work needs to look the way it did before at all in terms of structures or in terms of culture. Like I was just listening to something on NPR this morning about how, for millennials, of which I'm included in that group, like work was a place that was family. It was a place for social for socialization, and that's where you met people. My nieces and nephews who are, 5 years old, they've had some interaction in person, and they certainly have that, but they're also interacting already, like over the interwebs in a ton of different ways. And so to assume that they're going to need the same things out of a corporate culture that we have over the last 50 or 100 years feels foolish. Things are changing so fast. And so I think, questions on my mind with respect to that are like, why are we set up the way we're set up? My team actually just did a little bit of a reorganization internally. And I had someone say, oh, we're not part of the people team anymore, so I'm going to really miss those people. Like, that's wild that we think that way, that you have to be in a team or sitting near someone to connect with them. And how do we break that down and continue to build on like the distributed connections we've had over the last 20 months? I think certainly there's going to be a lot more fluidity and transition. So some people are asking other questions about onboarding and related things in the chat, and we've seen the great reshuffling. I think that's impacted, a retail and service industry more so than tech, but it's evolving. Your relationship with your company may change entirely, and so there's going to be challenges that we have to figure out about, more fluid movement in and out, and what does that mean? And on the topic of onboarding, we specifically said, hey, we're not going to bring people in, and we're not going to do it in person. We're going to onboard people virtually and recognize that that's a change, and that's the way that we're going to generally interact. And we'll bring people together for what we're calling Z retreats, these meaningful kind of think executive offsite gatherings to gather with cohorts or with teams, but on a much less frequent basis. So all of those are going to have impacts. And then I think the last thing I'll offer is like back to the one Zoom, all Zoom. We took the conference room technology as we knew it out of our conference rooms. And Svenja, we're not using that, we're not going in a ton. I think what people's intent to go back to the office was versus actual behavior. I've got some data on that for Zillow to share if interested, folks are interested. But we're changing the norms and saying, if you go into the office, it looks different because now we're optimizing for a distributed world. And so we're on laptops and headphones, no matter where you join in. We've taken the old conference room technology out and said, you're not going to have a meeting where you're around. And maybe hybrid technology from Microsoft or Zoom or somebody else will catch up, but we sort of stopped chasing that problem and said, the problem we have to chase is we've got a distributed workforce now. And so I think there's like tons of changes coming for company cultures.
I'm curious, given our audience, we're a bunch of economists, data scientists, applied scientists, and every so often we enjoy a good brainstorming session with a whiteboard. And and how do you all think about that? And there was an interesting question in the chat here about the cost of getting together in person. So you all travel and you can do one, Meghan talked about the Z retreats that Zillow is now doing. And so we get people together twice a quarter or something like that to actually work in person, or you can elect to come into the office to do some of that whiteboarding or brainstorming together. How do we think about perhaps the trade-offs there, the costs involved with travel, or the cost involved with not being able to brainstorm? Are there remote tools that you all have seen that will make this easier? But I do feel like a lot of the work that we do sometimes does require in-person collaboration, and sometimes it doesn't. We've gotten very good at not necessarily being in person, but curious to hear your thoughts on that one particularly.
So I can jump in. So I think just as a personal, you asked specifically how we do it. So I actually have a couple of co-authors who are far away. So it's been, we've been doing remote work for ages when you have co-authors in different places. And this one colleague in particular, we used to get on, originally Skype, and now of course we use Zoom. And we had the Zoom board that I sign in with my iPad, and then that's our whiteboard. And we quite literally just have a whiteboard session that we just work on, and it's been working for ages. And what we used to do as well is share screens and have our a Stata up, and we would code together, and it was actually as if we were sitting next to each other, which was great. And for me, what I've noticed just anecdotally, personally, was that my relationships that I had with my co-authors before, where we used to work that way, it was rather easy to transfer onto just doing this. We used to work like this before the pandemic, right? But it only works because both of us are happy to be on Zoom for 3 hours, 4 hours together. When we need to go and get coffee, we just pull off our headphones, go do something, come back and leave everything on. And it hasn't worked as well with co-authors who don't like to stay on Zoom for that long. So I guess I love the way that you said one Zoom, all Zoom, because it really seems like there's this, there's going to be some sort of, differences across people who all like to do stuff online and feel comfortable doing so, and those who don't. And once I think, again, from a managerial standpoint, I think the challenge is going to be trying to bridge those two groups, because the people who like to work on Zoom or don't mind, like is not even necessary, it's just as long as you feel comfortable enough, they can keep doing that all the time. And then others who don't, it might be harder to do that. And it may be that in the future, what we end up seeing is just also just a natural sorting, right? You just see people sorting into companies that mostly do that kind of work, and it's going to be advertised in our job descriptions, fully remote and things like that, and you end up seeing people who kind of self-sort into the different categories. But one thing I wanted to just add on the culture part was that what I thought was really interesting back in the day when we used to run our call center, which is our call center of doing these interviews. About halfway through the project, people were very tired of being on the phone all the time. And what we used to do is we always brought in a mini fridge full of beer. I know these were all students, right? So they were super happy to see that, physically see the mini fridge full of beer. And we said, if you meet the targets at the end of this week, this fridge is yours. And we tried to do something similar this past time when we had the distributed teams to try to think about giving vouchers and stuff. It just didn't work the same, because the point was actually seeing that little, so, but again, I think that was very much a managerial challenge that we couldn't rise to. We couldn't quite think of the appropriate way of how to incentivize a distributed team in the same way. it was a short-term project, so there wasn't anything that we could bring them into, you know, a meeting at the end. But I think as we think through a lot of the longer term, how to engage teams who you expect to have tenure, that's one thing. But how do we then engage teams that are sort of more short term, or do we even care because they're short term? So I know that's more of a question than an answer, but I'll leave it there.
That's totally fine.
I guess, Svenja, I'd jump in on that one too and say like that phrase, but how do you brainstorm if you're not in person together, has irked me the whole pandemic, because it's like, that's all we know. Our research is so biased because like that's the way we worked and that's the way we brainstorm. So if in 5 years from now we've determined we can't brainstorm, or maybe 10, that it's not possible to brainstorm virtually, and we've got some data to show that, that will be more interesting. But right now I think it's like, we're all, even some of the questions in the chat refer to this. This is how I learned. So how are we going to help other people learn that way? And it's like, we might be doing this all differently. And if the last 20 months have shown us anything, it's that certain industries, you can keep going. Now, to Daniela's point, when you try to pull in the like norms of the past into a virtual environment, a beer fridge doesn't translate super well, but that doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. And I'm not saying that I have all the answers. I just think they're out there and we're going to find them.
And so we can brainstorm online.
You know, I have to chuckle as I look at my like 50 open Google Doc tabs that I've got going that I'm trying to organize up here, where we're constantly working on docs together. Anyway, I'm curious. What's is Daniela, you spoke a little bit about how there's going to be sorting into different types of jobs. If you have a preference for being in person, you'll sort into that job versus going into a hybrid or a remote environment if you have those preferences. Is that going to bring up, particularly if at the same company, is that going to bring up this two-class system? And what are your chances of being perhaps unfairly being seen more if you're in person? You know, there's this FaceTime concept, and you have the ability to weigh in more, speak up more, see people on their way to the bathroom, the kitchen, whatever it may be. And are you more likely to be promoted? And what can companies do to avoid that type of scenario?
Was that for me, or?
Oh yeah, go for it.
Were you just throwing it out there?
I was just throwing it out there, but yes, I'd love to hear your answer.
So, I mean, I think we're definitely going to spend the next 10 years doing research on that. I think what we've seen, there's a lot of really great work from my colleagues who have looked at networks, and especially most of the time, the work I'm thinking of is so Zoe Cullen at Harvard has done a lot of work on this, and she's done a lot of really interesting research on like networks that have to do with golfing or smoking, and this is sort of and the old boys network of and then how that translates into opportunities for women to advance or not advance and so on. And so I think wonderfully there's two potential outcomes here, right? So we could be that the fact that most people are remote, or a lot of people are remote, the work might speak for itself a little bit more, but it might also be that all of the opportunities of FaceTime are then only in the social realm, in which case you might not have that opportunity of being invited when you're just sort of in the office and so on. So I'm afraid on that question, I have literally zero answers at this point. But I do think it's a really important area for us to actually look at as we go on. I also think you guys in organizations who have all the data might be even in a better position, especially as you know all your employee data, and it's a lot harder for us economists who outside of the organizations who don't have access to everything and how people have moved. We have these employer-employee match data sets, which are really helpful, but I think will be really interesting, and I hope a lot of people in especially the tech companies can, economists and people who do research in tech companies can look into is teams and how the teams are working across being distributed or hybrid or whatever, and how those things might affect these kind of opportunities. But I think we're at a point it can go either way, and I think it'd be nice if we could brainstorm a little bit more about how to make sure that we don't repeat the horrible norms that we had in the past.
On that, and this question has come up a bunch of times in our chat here as well. How do you all measure? And we can measure productivity, Sonia has made the point that's hard to actually get great numbers on, but there's lots of different things we want to be able to measure. And I know that Microsoft has been at the forefront of more employees surveying and releasing that work. Zillow has upped the frequency of updating or the frequency of surveys in general, and making sure employees are heard. You know, there's this whole the Great Resignation is happening. One of the reasons that people are talking about a hypothesis there is that employees feel like they're not being heard, and they want a better match to their needs and their preferences. So how do you all go about measuring? How, Sonia, how does Microsoft think about this measurement problem and getting good data to actually be able to make better decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's surveys, there's, I mentioned, like, for some professions, engineers, you can look at pull request activity, you can look at collaboration activity. And I have worked with co-authors on a paper using Teams telemetry data to see like who people are meeting with, who they're having calls or IMs, emails type stuff with. I think there's a lot of different data sources out there, and none of them are like exactly productivity, and all of them give us a bit of insight from one angle or another. I also wanted to speak on the previous question. I mean, the presence bias is something that Microsoft is very aware of and thinking about how to combat. And I think it's a lot like a lot of other biases, right? If you make sure people are being evaluated based on objective criteria and like what they accomplished and not what you thought of them, or what, I mean, there's lots of biases in evaluating people. And I think presence is just another dimension on which we're going to have to try and debias and fight the bias on. But yeah, on the data front, I think the answer is everything. You look at what you have, and economists are often suspicious of surveys, but often it's the best you can do.
I think I can speak to a couple of things at Zillow. I think one is like, we weren't really measuring productivity before, not from an HR standpoint. We were looking at it from a business output standpoint. And are we achieving the goals that we want to? And, you know, is our revenue growing and things like that? And, you know, we'll continue to look at business outputs as one of those things. That's not an HR centric measurement. But then we are doing a lot of surveying, and I think and then we're also doing like different types of measurement through tool usage and through an office booking tool that we created. And I'll speak to that one because I think it's really interesting. We've been surveying since the beginning of the pandemic about how often would you want to work from home, and that has been steadily increasing, steadily and drastically increasing from when we asked in spring 2020. About 30% of people said, oh, I might like this remote flexibility, you know, X number of times. And then that jumped to 60% who are really interested in like much more sort of remote, like leaning out of office. And we saw that evolution. In spring 2021, we saw 40% of our respondents, which is the majority of Zillow, we get about 90% response rate on our surveys, said, hey, I plan to come in between once a week and once every other week. And the other 60% said, I don't plan to come in. I'm one of those. And of those 40%, so you could use that as our best leading indicator of like people who want to come in and intend to come in, because we've been asking a bunch. So then we introduced office booking technology, really simple stuff, when we opened our offices in September. There's lots of variant's the wrong word. There's lots of factors like the Delta variant that we can't be sure, you know, what's causing what behavior, but only 12% of our population has booked even one day in office in the next this is over the course of this first 3 months since we opened the office. And of those, only 2/3 of that 12% actually come in. So it's been fascinating to see, okay, intent about where we're going to be comfortable working, and our desires about it, and then our intent to come in, and our actual behavior when given the choice of not commuting in the morning is different. Now, again, lots of factors of if your whole team's not there, why go in? And so there's a lot to keep watching here, but we're focused less on sort of pure productivity management and watching that through the goals of our business, and the ways we want to take those goals and what we want to achieve. And then in terms of these like the sentiment data and this behavioral data that we can watch and learn from and make decisions around.
Perhaps the last question I thought we'd dive into, and it's a big one, so we won't really get to all the nitty gritty the last 6 minutes here. But how do you all think about the pandemic being a bit of a great equalizer in terms of the access to work? We now are able to hire from across the country, across the globe even. We're able to accommodate different lifestyles. I drop my daughter off at school in the morning, so remote work has been fantastic for me because I don't have to sit in the car for an hour and a half on my way to work anymore. And so that gives me a lot more opportunity. And or does it swing the other way and there's too much self-sorting and you don't have enough opportunities in the long run? What are your thoughts on that one? And are we going to look back on this time as a major shift in terms of how we approach work, and a positive one at that?
I mean, this doesn't really answer the question, but I think there are positive forces for equality. I would flag that there are risks as well. I mean, I think that we've seen data in both directions, right? In LinkedIn, women are more likely to apply for remote jobs. And so like, there's definitely an inclusive factor there. But on the other hand, we talked about presence bias. And if within a company, women are more likely to want to work from home, then is that going to affect their career trajectories? And then I think another big piece that sometimes missed is like, not everyone has good space at home to work from, right? Like in some, say schools and offices were equalizers, right? Like everyone went in, and like in public schools, like you were all sitting in the same classroom, no matter how big your bed or how many people you were sharing your bedroom at home with. And in the office, like, yes, more senior people get bigger offices or whatever, but like everyone's there no matter what their living situation at home. And so we saw at the beginning of the pandemic with like some people not wanting to turn on cameras because of like what they would be sharing with their colleagues about their living situation at home. And I think that going forward, it's going to be a similar issue of like, yes, companies provide salaries, but historically they also provided a place to work. And if with full remote companies, if we lose that, then that can have be a driving force towards inequality instead of equality.
Yeah, I second that. I think that's really important to think of both of those sides, and whether it's going to have which way it swings. I think will have a lot to do with how much of the self-sorting ends up happening and for what the reasons for the sorting are. I also think there's a question that was a really good question raised in the chat on diversity and the perspectives of like diverse interactions in the workplace. And yeah, you might have people from all over the place, but because you're no longer sort of did you have to be in the same room for doing these whiteboard sessions? I personally don't think you necessarily have to, because I've been able to do whiteboard sessions even with my students very well. But one thing I noticed was that it was always the same voices unmuting their camera and unmuting their microphone to speak up. And so it took a lot of effort to actually coax the voices of the other people who might have not been happy to unmute their video and thus didn't feel comfortable unmuting their microphone as well. So I think, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think there's a lot of space for managers there, for making sure that they are actually pulling together, the different factions, the different factors to steer us in more of the equality rather than the other that could very easily go towards the exacerbating inequalities that we surely don't want to exacerbate.
Yeah, there was also a question early in the chat, which I think fits in here as well, and something I know we've thought about also in terms of when you have very, young professionals entering the workforce for the first time. And, a lot of times you learn on the job, you learn by observing your colleagues, you learn by observing your manager in everyday interactions and, by looking over their shoulders. So this could be one of those moments where not having that access to the same shared office space or the ability to hear those diverse voices can be very can be very costly to the development of that young professional, or you could also make the argument that, okay, we need to be better from, and I think Meghan, you've made this point a whole bunch, right? That it'd be silly to think that what we did for the last 50 years is going to work for the next 50 years, given that our variables of the environment have changed. So we just need to be a lot more active in addressing these. And I think I'm with all of you when we say it's a little too early to tell quite yet, right? We need to collect a bunch more data, and it's not obvious to me which way we're going to fall yet. Are we going to be able to kind of control for some of these risks and pitfalls and change human behavior to be able to address them? Or are we actually going to, learn the hard way? And I'm sure we'll learn the hard way in some instances, but can we kind of get there? We have probably like 50 seconds. Any closing thoughts you all want to share?
I think we can figure it out. So I think there's a bunch of challenges ahead, but I think that, and whether the pandemic is a great equalizer or not, I won't speak to, but is it game changing in how we work? And is there technologies to support it? And is there appetite for it and behavior that suggests people want it? Yes. So maybe it's not for everybody, but I, for one, am never going back to an office full time ever again in my career. Mark my words.
Excellent. That sounds great. Daniela, Sonia, anything to add?
I just put in the chat, I think that like there's a lot to learn and figure out, and remote and hybrid collaboration will get better. I do think that like some of us have a pretty warped view in terms of like being in the US, the tech sector being super conservative about opening offices. Like there's a lot of places where people are back in the workplace already, both internationally, I think is more than the US. And because people have less commutes and less space at home or more in-person expectations, and outside of the tech sector. So I think that it will be a balance, and that I have no idea where the balance will end up.
Yeah, I echo that. I think we'll figure it out. I agree with Meghan. We'll figure it out in some way. It will take a bit of time just to kind of understand where the sorting is going. And I think, one way to think about it is that now there's a whole other set of options for people who might prefer this kind of work, right? So Meghan can stay, can be home, and it's great. And I, for one, would prefer going to the office maybe once, twice a week maximum. And, great, I go when I have to teach in person, which I very much prefer to teach in person than online. So, and, it seems like that's fine. So I think we'll figure it out. It's just going to take a little bit of adjustment period, but hopefully, because we're thinking about these issues, we can tweak the potential downsides as much as we can to, avoid the inequality problems and those kind of issues as we, brave this new world. So I'll stop there.
Excellent. Well, thank you. All three of you, really appreciate you joining me today. Fantastic answers, and we'll leave on that note. We'll figure it out. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.